ko Holly Thorpe ko Whenua. My name's Holly Thorpe. I'm a professor in the Division of Health at the University of Waikato, and it's an honour and a privilege to be chairing the session today, where we have 3 presentations this morning, and then we'll have 2 this afternoon with a discussion. And I think if you join us for both of them, you're going to see a lot of themes and ideas, lots of synergies across the papers. So the title of this overall session is I was tracking it every day, how digital health applications are changing the way menstruators and people trying to conceive, understand themselves and their bodies. This has been brought together by Professor Sarah Riley and her team. And we're going to kick off with Siobhán Healy-Cullen presenting on this amazing topic. So over to you, Siobhán.
Thanks, Holly. So tēnā koutou katoa, ko airani whakapaparanga mai, ko Kenny, te whenua tupu, te noho au ki te whanganui ātara, ko Siobhán Healy-Cullen. So hello everyone, my name is Siobhán and I'm Irish, as my name and my accent probably gives away, but I'm now living in Wellington and I'm working as part of the health psychology team at Massey University. And today I'm talking to you on behalf of this wonderful research team about research carried out with folks who have recently had a baby and who are also using menstruation tracking apps. So for many people, tracking apps have become part of the TTC journey, the trying to conceive journey. And so we're interested in menstruation tracking apps precisely because they have become a quotidian technology. It's estimated that menstrual tracking apps as a whole have over 100 million users globally. But we're also interested in menstruation tracking apps because they are not a neutral technology. They shape users' understandings of their bodies and their identities. They're also not neutral in the sense that these apps imagine a stable body as the norm. So the imagined user has a relatively stable menstrual cycle and is not at a point in their life where it's changing. And this is of interest to us as critical health psychologists because many users are not the imagined prototypical user of a cisgender, heterosexual, able-bodied, slim white woman with a regular cycle managing fertility. So our wider research project is looking at the experiences of people who don't fit the imagined menstruation tracking app user in terms of experiencing changes in their bodies at particular life stages, such as those who have recently had a baby, people who are in perimenopause, and teenagers who are getting used to their menstruating bodies. So our focus is on folks who are in these life stages, but we're also interested in speaking with people who identify with some of the groups that we have listed here, who are typically underrepresented or marginalized in research, and again, who are not that imagined prototypical app user. So in this talk, I'm presenting on data that was generated with participants who had a baby in the last 2 years. And then later, Sarah, who's also working on the project with me, is going to talk to you about the perimenopause cohort. So we collected data through 7 cooperative inquiry groups held with 23 diverse users of menstruation tracking apps across Aotearoa, New Zealand, and these groups are all held over Zoom. So cooperative inquiry is a small group action research method where groups of similarly identified people come together to explore issues of mutual concern over time. So in our study, each group met somewhere between 3 to 5 times, allowing discussions to evolve and to deepen over several sessions. And I can say more about this research method if there are any pad thai afterwards. Okay, so that's just a bit about the overall project. And within that then, I was particularly interested in exploring discursive constructions of menstruation tracking apps in new parents' talk, addressing a gap on menstruation tracking app use in that post-birth period. So we were interested in how participants navigate and resist dominant discourses of femininity, of health, of motherhood, and of parenthood. And so we used a critical feminist discursive approach in our analysis, looking for patterns of sense-making in the data. And in those patterns, I was paying attention to the wider discourses, allowing that sense-making and the kind of subject positions or persons that were produced in that talk. So, for example, talk associated with being a good reproductive citizen. And all of this was taking place in the particular micro-discursive context, the localized context of these cooperative inquiry groups. So for the rest of the presentation, I'm going to describe some of these dominant discursive patterns that we identified in participants' talk and how that mediated, how the app mediated subjectivity. So overall, participants' talk was resourced by an overarching discourse of obligatory digitally mediated TTC. And this discourse was characterized by a framing of menstruation tracking apps as a necessity for those trying to conceive. So this discourse constructs tracking as part of being a serious reproductive citizen. It's something you must do if you're serious about getting pregnant. So as I'll show, while participants problematize the apps in various ways, invoking this discourse allowed them to both distance themselves from the app's flaws and to justify their use. You have to use the app, not because it necessarily feels good, but because to not use it would be negligent. So this discourse of obligatory digitally mediated TTC works to relieve some of these problematizations of the app, allowing users to critique them without rejecting them entirely. Scaffolded by this overarching discourse, there was 3 particular discursive patterns that we identified across the data set. Is this 70 bucks going to get me a baby? Americanized white woman wellness vibes, so off-putting. And fertility teamwork, it's almost like he had a bit of power over me. So I'm going to take you through each of these in turn. The first one, is this 70 bucks going to get me a baby? Captures a kind of care control paradox, where tracking apps are constructed as being caring, as being there for you, offering you support and some kind of empowerment, and ultimately the possibility of a baby. But they were also constructed as extractive tools, always wanting you to upgrade premium and putting paywalls in place to access historical data, for example. So this repeated reference to price was not simply a practical concern for participants, but we interpreted it as a kind of a discursive resource through which participants problematize the commodification of conception itself. So, for example, Sam says, it feels so unjust because there's already like a gender pay gap. We know there's pink tax on lots of things, and can a period tracking app be considered a pink tax? I don't know, that could be argued. But double down on the fact that there's also like a queer pay gap as well. And it's just like, why? Why are you making us pay for this much of it? Yeah. Is this 70 bucks going to get me a baby? And Chloe says, I wouldn't initially think I'm going to pay for premium, especially like trying for your first. But then you're like, okay, if this is going to help me get a baby because it's going to educate me when it's the right time to try and all of that sort of thing, then I'm like, yeah, I definitely do it for the right price. And I suppose that drive would go up, or the willingness to pay more would go up the longer you're trying, Like you're sort of, if you've been trying for a while, and yeah, you sort of just do whatever. I feel like the stakes almost seem higher. So you're like, you become a bit more obsessed with the data and wondering day to day what's going to happen. So Sam framed this cost as unjust, evoking a kind of a digital pink tax. And Chloe's phrasing, if this is going to help me get a baby, does significant discursive work in that it frames the app as an investment, positioning conception as something that might be achieved through the right purchase. And so the 70 bucks question is not simply about cost, but about how much one is willing to pay or how much one should pay to do the right thing. And that is to remain positively situated within that discourse of obligatory digitally mediated TTC as a serious reproductive citizen who is able and willing to invest in their reproductive body through tracking. So the second pattern, Americanized white woman wellness vibes, is so off-putting, captures how tracking apps erase diverse users by privileging white cis heteronormative North American reproductive experiences. So rainbow participants encountered alienating assumptions, while Maori participants described how the apps were misaligned with Te Ao Maori understandings of menstruation and of natal care. So for example, Alex said, I get the vibe of like upper middle class, like something has been designed exclusively for upper middle class white women in America who have very like uniform periods, who have very like positive experiences with healthcare, who have very traditional relationships and traditional experiences in the world. I think that gives me, that's really like I keep using the word alienating, but that's because that's the actual experience. Like, it makes something feel alienating. It makes it feel like this app isn't for me. Like, I don't relate to like the white woman wellness besties. Like, I'm a recovering drug addict who's like queer and experiencing my body in a very different way. And so that kind of like, that Americanized like white woman wellness vibes just is so off-putting for me. So I think this extract really captures the problematization of most mainstream menstrual tracking apps as alienating, misfitting, and normatively narrow for non-prototypical users. And this was the case not only in terms of the relationships that were presumed by the app, so heterosexual, monogamous couples that were trying for a baby, but also in the language and the imagery and the tone of the apps, what many referred to quite dismissively as woo-woo vibes. Throughout the project, though, some participants talk about misfitting led to explorations of alternatives that could better align with their values and lived realities. So when Alex tried the AHOA app, which is an app that's centered around the Maramataka, the Maori lunar calendar, their account constructed AHOA as offering cultural familiarity and resonance in contrast to the alienation of dominant tracking apps. Overall, though, most participants were using apps that they problematized as some kind of a misfit. And so their enduring engagement with the apps, despite describing how they can feel extractive and like a misfit, really demonstrate how that discourse of obligatory digitally mediated TTC leads people to tolerating that sense of misfit. Finally then, fertility teamwork, it's almost like he had a bit of power over me, captures the really animated talk about partner sharing features on menstruation tracking apps. So this feature is ostensibly designed to redistribute reproductive labour and make the process of trying to conceive more collaborative. Although this feature on the surface is framed as supportive and more egalitarian, participants' talk indicated kind of deeper discomforts and tensions around surveillance and of power. So, for example, Sam says, it's kind of like, do you want to have that to be your consent to having sex for like the rest of the week or whatever? Like, do you want, like, where does that actually play in the communication of a relationship? And Tui more explicitly describes they can download it and then they can see, which pissed me off because then he would be like, oh, you're in your luteal phase and this is why you're being a bitch or something. And I'm just like, okay, you need to delete that. Like, that's not okay. You know, like it's almost like he had a bit of power over me. And I'm just like, no, that's not what this is about. So these partner sharing tools were problematized as implicitly signaling an invitation or even an obligation to initiate sex during ovulation windows. And Tui is also expressing concern here that the tracking data, once it's shared, could become justification for some kind of dismissal, where her moods, her energy, or her disinterest might not be just respected on their own terms, but would be mediated through the app. The risk being then that she's recognized as only hormones. I think this resistance to the partner sharing feature is really interesting and notable within the otherwise quite largely compliant discourse of obligatory digitally mediated TTC. While participants generally accepted the necessity of app use, even when it was considered culturally misaligned or extractive, the idea of sharing this data with a partner provoked quite overt discomfort. And so this resistance signals a moment where the discourse was actively negotiated, which tells us something interesting about those gendered divisions of fertility work in the context of fertility app use. So overall then, participants' talk shows how menstrual tracking apps are embedded in a discourse of obligatory digitally mediated TTC, where use is deemed necessary, even when apps are constructed as extractive, misfitting, and failing to support team fertility work. Menstrual tracking apps are therefore not constructed straightforwardly as empowering, even among those who are post-birth and have had success with these apps. So I'd finish by asking, how might we reimagine tracking apps that support diverse ways of knowing, of feeling, and of doing reproduction, rather than requiring users to tolerate extractive, profit-driven apps that are exclusionary and do not truly ease reproductive labour? Thank you.